G'day, folks. Today I want to talk about Vision, which is a story in Ireland, the collected stories by Alistair MacLeod. And in this story, there's a couple of Gaelic kind of names and phrases that are used. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on Gaelic pronunciation, but I did a bit of internet kind of searching, and the main kind of protagonist, or one of the central protagonists, I guess, in this story is a man who goes by the name of Mark Un Avides, which means in Gaelic the son of uncertainty or the son of doubt, and his real name is Alex. So it kind of looks like Mac and Amharuis, but it's pronounced Mark Un Avides. And he possesses at some stages, along with some other characters in the story, an ability to I guess have foresight, or to have a second sight, which is pronounced Dahalug, even though it looks like Dashilad, it's Dahalug. So again, Gaelic pronunciation's a little bit funny with the letters there, but a couple of times I'm going to be referring to these names, and I'll probably stuff them up, but bear with me because that's roughly how they're pronounced. Okay, why am I looking at Vision as a story? Well, I think it's quite hard. I think Vision, in terms of the stories inside Ireland, Vision is a story that is quite difficult, because it's a complicated narrative. There's stories within stories within stories, and it's kind of tough to grapple with. However, if you are willing to go with it and actually read it closely and engage in it, there is lots and lots in it. And I actually think in some ways, if you can bear with it, it's actually easier than some of the other stories. Because while some of the other stories deal with the notion of, Cape Breton and leaving and going and coming and belonging and being an outsider, I think this story Vision is about, I guess, two main ideas, in my opinion, and certainly there's more than two main ideas that come through it loud and clear. And so if you're willing to understand the stories within it, and how the narrative unfolds, then there's actually some kind of pretty good meaning you can get out of this story. So the theory I'm running here is basically based on that 2016 Examiner's report that suggested that real high scoring responses have an assured capacity to closely analyse the text. So that assured capacity is essentially, if you really kind of break that down and talk about it a bit more, that means knowing and being confident in the text that you're talking about. And I think, I've mentioned to my class plenty of times that I think a lot of people will talk about The Boat, for instance, in Ireland. Why? Because it's the first story that we read, and it's a brilliant story. There is so much in it for us to talk about, to analyse, to bring to essay topics of various natures. There's so much in The Boat. But I think it's a good idea to have a really good spread of stories. And I think Vision is one that I think people will shy away from because it's tough, it's so complicated because there's stories within stories that people won't go there. So if you're willing to go there, I guess I'm saying you'll stand out. I think if you can go there and talk well on Vision and show you understand Vision, you'll stand out. Okay, so first thing to do with Vision is to understand how the story works and who's related to who, which gets complicated. But essentially, if we start with the narrator, okay, and he's I guess writing this story as a father, so he's probably an adult, okay, so he's an adult, and he recalls himself being on the boat as a child with his father, okay, who is called Alex. That's the narrator's father. You can see the mouse hovering over there, who is blind. Okay, he's been blind. He stormed the beach at Normandy in World War II, and was blinded by a mortar. The narrator's grandmother is the baby girl. Okay, it was a twin girl who was given birth to. The narrator's mother. No, narrator's grandmother, sorry. So the narrator's father's mother is the baby girl who was given birth by the narrator's great-grandmother, who was the blind woman and ex-lover of Mark Un Avides, okay, on the island of Canna a number of generations ago. So that's quite confusing in itself because there is a number of generations that we need to keep up with here. In addition to that, Mark Un Avides, who had a relationship with this woman from Cana, and we don't know her name, she's only ever referred to as the woman or the woman from Cana. Those two had quite an interesting relationship. It was certainly fraught with arguments and drunken kind of antics, but ultimately Mark Unavides became possessed by the Halug, or the second sight, and it really weighed on him. And so they went to this clergyman, and this is these two people here. And this clergyman said, well, if you want to get rid of these visions that you're getting, you're going to have to abandon your love. You're basically going to have to not see each other anymore. And ultimately, Mark Un Avides decided, well, I don't want these visions anymore. And 2 months later, he took up with the blind woman's sister, and they ended up getting married. However, they didn't have kids. They couldn't have kids. And it's implied, I guess, that Mark Un Avides, despite the fact that he gave up his relationship with the blind woman, or the woman from Cana, they continued seeing each other and having sex, and ultimately, she fell pregnant despite the fact that they weren't living together, and she gave birth to baby girls, one of whom died, the other one who lived, and ultimately became the narrator's grandmother. So it's quite a convoluted kind of family tree, but if you can understand that as the basics, then it becomes easier to follow. Okay, so what happens in this story? Let's have a brief recap. So the boy recalls the day he was in the boat with his blind father, and they're coming back from a fishing trip. He waves to his friend Kenneth McAllister, who belongs to a rival fishing family. They kind of both fish the same waters, and they have arguments over whose waters belong to who. And he recalls a story. The narrator recalls a story where Kenneth tells him of being related to someone with the Halug, the second sight, and he kind of thinks it's a cool story. And then, as they're coming home, the father tells the story of going to visit his grandmother on Cana, an island which is 20 miles away, with his twin brother Angus when they were 11. And so he proceeds to tell this story to the narrator about when they went. So they catch this boat to Cana as children. A man picks them up in the rain, and they tell the man they're visiting their grandmother, and the man drops them off at the house of the woman, who we know is their grandmother, but they don't know it yet. And later on in the story, we kind of realise why, because that's their actual grandmother, the blind woman, not the actual sister, who they think is their grandmother. So after a while, they make their way to Mark Un Avides' house, and his wife, who is not their grandmother, is the sister of their actual grandmother, and they see their grandfather fondling himself. And in the story, he's described as highly sexed. He's someone who has high libido. And they stay a week there, and the grandfather tells stories of Saint Columba, who also had Dahalu, who established the chapel on Cana. And he says to the boys, sometimes there are things within us which we do not know or fully understand, and sometimes it is hard to stamp out what you can't see. And the boys then catch the boat home after a week. They see some smoke, and ultimately it turns out the blind woman has burnt to death in her house, and that is their real grandmother who was burnt to death. So the narrator's father, he and his brother, Alex and Angus, their names, they go to enlist in World War I about 6 years later, and they meet a fellow Gaelic speaker from Cana as they're enlisting, and they ask him, do you know Mark Un Avides or Alex? And he says, yes, well, I do. And then he tells the boys, this is narrator's father and his brother, the story of Mark Un Avides. So here we go into a story within a story. And so, he's described as a bright, highly sexed young man, and this Gaelic speaker from Cana tells them that he becomes involved with a woman from Cana who is described as odd. This is the boy's grandmother, the real grandmother. He then becomes possessed with Dahalug, sees events he can't stop, it weighs heavy on him. They go see a clergyman, advises them to give each other up. The blind woman, or the woman, cracks it. Mark Un Avides begins to see her sister. He then marries the sister. And a while goes past, and he and the blind woman's father discover the woman in a barn eyes gouged out, and she's given birth to twin girls, only one who's lived, and she's permanently blind. Markul Avides then and his wife couldn't have children, so they end up raising the baby, which is his daughter anyway, and this turns out to be the narrator's grandmother. From here, the story cuts back to the father of the narrator, who signs back up for World War II after serving in World War I, and loses that doesn't make sense there, but it says and loses and is blinded storming the beach at Normandy. However, all the soldiers around him died. But he felt, when the mortar went off, he felt the strong hand on his shoulder of his real grandmother, and it's implied that she saves his life. He yells out, "Who's there?" and he hears a voice that says, "It is myself." And he feels a grip on his left shoulder, and as he turns to look, his eyes are blown out, but he lives, and all the soldiers around him died. On that very same day that he's blinded, Markul Avides dies, and he's well over 100 years old by that time. Then the story cuts back to the narrator on the boat with his father. And so you can see we go story into a story into a story, and then goes back to this kind of original story. And they get back from the fishing trip, which is the last of the season. They go to the Legion Hall where the local fishermen are getting drunk. Fights break out between the McAllisters and the narrator's family over an insult due to the father's blindness. And Kenneth, the young boy, loses his eye from the rival family, the young boy from the rival family. The McAllisters and the narrator's family then form a truce, and the story cuts to the narrator as a father himself writing the aforementioned stories. So here is the complication, I guess. There's stories within stories. Okay, and ultimately, this is, I think, the first of the 2 points that I think this story is about. The story vision is about stories. It is about how stories can turn into each other. And the narrator begins by referring to the story and how it made an impression on me and more or less became mine. He talks about how it went into him and he knew it would not leave but remain there forever. So the notion of stories that get stuck and belong to us. And there's kind of 5 stories, I guess, on this boat. It starts off the story of him and his father on the boat. It then goes to Kenneth's story and about his relative who has the Harlug, and then it goes to his father telling him about his story about visiting Markul Avides when he was a child, and then there's a story from the soldier that they meet about Markul Avides, and then it cuts back to the original story of the narrator and the fight that they had at the bar and Kenneth losing his eye. So there's kind of 5 stories within stories here. And there's a quote on 366. This has been the telling of a story about a story, but like most stories, it has spun off into others and relied on others, and perhaps no story ever really stands alone. And ultimately, I think this is what vision is about. It's a story that says how, individual stories don't exist, that stories overlap and intertwine, and they belong with each other. I think McLeod uses vision as a way to talk about how hard it is to separate one story from another. And particularly when we think about generations of family, there isn't really one story for a person's family. It's a range of stories combined together that make up a family history. And ultimately, that's what we see here. The other thing, I think, and this is quite a lengthy point, is the idea of vision as a symbol or a motif or a central concern. I mean, the story itself is named Vision, to see. And there are many references to seeing or imagining or recalling or sight or blindness. And all of these things, I guess, are linked in meaning to that idea of vision, okay, that word vision. The beginning of the story, the father says to the narrator to hide some lobsters, and he says, what they won't see won't hurt them, referring to the people who buy the lobsters. And, I guess the question I ask is ultimately, do you think that's true in the story? Because he's essentially saying ignorance is bliss. If you don't know it, it won't hurt you. And I think later on we come to question that a little bit. Kenneth's story about a relative in Scotland who possessed the Harlug, he then says, I wouldn't want to be blind, because he wants to join the Air Force and fly towards the sun and see across the sea. And I think, blindness could potentially be argued here that in story that the people who are blind or become blind may essentially be stuck to a place. they're not able to achieve what they want to achieve. We see that in the woman from Canna who ultimately doesn't get to be with Markul Navades. We see that in Kenneth, who loses an eye and ultimately doesn't get to be an Air Force pilot. The boy's father, whilst not necessarily being stuck, I guess, never really sees his son, and he's reliant on others. So that idea of blindness being, stuck, maybe we could talk about that. Alex and Angus, so this is the narrator's father and his twin brother, their parents tell them repeatedly to wait and see, and when they keep begging to go to Canna, and ultimately they get there, and maybe McLeod here is suggesting that wanting to know everything can sometimes lead to stories going into you and remaining there forever, because ultimately they went to Canna and the narrator's father was left with this experience that he had over there. That was confusing at the time because he didn't really understand it, and only later on did he come to understand, who that blind woman really was, and who his grandfather, who was fondling himself in the barn, really was. The twins' other real grandmother, so this is their maternal grandmother, reads tea leaves, and it's implied that she sees what will happen on Canna, and there's that quote there where she says that's enough for today when she's reading them to the boys, and again, we get here an example of things that might be worrying about knowing the future. When the boys are picked up on Canna, the man who picks them up says, "Do you know where you are going?" And the woman, the blind woman, says, "Can you see your way in the dark?" So there's kind of, I guess, poignant quotes, I think, that have to do with vision in this story. Markul Navades says of St. Columba, sometimes I think I can see him, when the boys say, do you ever, when he's talking to the boys about this saint who established a chapel or a church on the island of Canna. And he says that many people from Canna have scattered all over the world. And then he says that sometimes there are things within us which we do not know or fully understand, and sometimes it is hard to stamp out what you can't see. And I guess the question here we might think about, could he be talking about how difficult it has been for him stamping out his love for their real grandmother? And in the last sentence of the story, the narrator does say that it's difficult to see and understand the tangled, twisted strands of love. And I think, you could really connect that quote with that quote from Markul Navades when he says, there's lots of things we don't fully see and understand, and it's hard to stamp out what you can't see. So the boys don't see the house burn down later on, but they, the narrator does talk about how his father and their brother imagined the flames flickering and framing her face, and they imagine the mating cats in the blind woman's house who keep mating as the fire rages, driven by their own heat while the other heat surrounded them. These are their just imaginations here, and they imagine the blind woman calling out who is there, and in their imaginations they imagine them responding, "It is myself." And we cast our minds back here to that quote at the beginning of this narrator story when the father says to him about hiding lobsters, what they don't know won't hurt. And, here the twins don't actually know what happened in that fire, but they have these imaginations, and they're plagued by these imaginations, I guess. Or maybe not plagued, but they certainly have them. And they're poignant enough to remember later on. And finally, the idea of seeing, I think, the notion of sight in this story is almost cyclical in that it's attached to life and to death and finally peace. So the blind woman, who is Alex's grandmother, lacerates her eyes during birth. So she goes blind, due to the pain of childbirth, and one baby lives. Okay, from that one baby lives. The narrator's father, Alex, on the day of his blinding, the man known as Markul Navades died. And so here, we see that sight is connected to the death of, I guess, the protagonist in this story. And so we've got life, the baby living, death in terms of Markul Navades dying when the narrator's father becomes blind, and then in the end, Kenneth's blindness in one eye in the bar fight ultimately causes a peace between, rival families, and it all seems so simple in hindsight. So I think, the actual idea of being able to see or being blind is connected to both, or to everything, to life, to death, and to, the peace, a truce being formed between warring families. So, it kind of, it's not, doesn't belong to one of those categories. I think there are times here where McLeod says that, suggests that blindness can lead to, is linked to the death of one character, or to the life of another character, or to peace between two characters' families. And just in brackets there, I've just got talking about when Makul Navades dies, and it's talking about how he babbled so much, even as an old man who was over 100, about Saint Columba and his determination to be ascetic, meaning, having severe self-discipline, by turning his back on Ireland and the region of his early love. And I think there's a link there again to that quote, to even in his old age, Makul Navades is talks about his love for the blind woman all that time, that it's so hard to turn your back on your early loves. So ultimately, what is vision about? I think, it's about the fact that stories and visions that are difficult to see and understand. And there's some great quotes there about, it's difficult ever to be certain of our judgments, or to ever fully see or understand. And I think the narrator is reflecting on the nature of stories and the way that they can become intertwined with each other, leaving it hard to separate one from another. And this can lead to confusion and uncertainty. Perhaps the best explanation is when the narrator's daughter quizzes him, "What has eyes but cannot see?" And the answer is a potato. And the narrator acknowledges that because of their lineage, they are both, in spite of their age and comprehension, indeed children of uncertainty. And it's here that McLeod seems to suggest that there are some things that we will never know, and that is okay, because that is reality. That's life. We don't always know things. This is a story about stories getting intertwined, about how, sight and being able to see, you're not always able to see. Just because you can see something visually, we don't know it. And ultimately, just because we can't, some people might not be able to see visually, they can still know, how they feel about others, and they can certainly see things in their own way. So, it's a story just about how all is not as we think of it all the time. So, how do we link that then, what we know about vision, to an essay? Well, I've just used two examples from the essay questions I gave my class at the bottom of my page. And the first one is Island Collected Stories suggest that individual lives are most meaningful when viewed in relation to the past. So it's a pretty kind of wordy question, this one. What does it mean? So I've just given like a sample, I guess, introductory paragraph, or maybe even a part of a body paragraph here. So vision shows readers that individual lives are almost always inextricably linked. The narrator's reflection about a combination of stories highlights the lives of many characters who are all gone now. In these stories, he reflects on the confusing nature of stories that intertwine and become connected, so that it is hard to separate one from another. Here, it seems that McLeod is suggesting that it is hard for individual lives to be meaningfully viewed in retrospect, because it is difficult ever to be certain of our judgments, or to ever fully see or understand. Via the narrator, McLeod pieces together stories that, like most stories, have spun off into others and relied on others, and perhaps no one story ever stands alone. When considering the past, that should only be one past there. When considering the past, the narrator of Vision suggests that it is difficult for him to meaningfully consider his life when he and his daughter are indeed the children of uncertainty. So here I'm kind of challenging the question and saying, well, no, there is a story within Ireland that suggests that individual lives aren't necessarily meaningful when viewed in relation to the past. They're just confusing at times, and they lead us to being uncertain about how we feel about things. So it's a little bit of a sit on the fence answer. It's saying, well, I kind of think that there is a story inside this that isn't necessarily saying that. Okay, the other essay topic was the stories in Ireland show the value of tradition in people's lives. Discussed, and this is one that I'm contending. I've got a contention that's in opposition to it, I guess. And so some characters referenced in the narrator's stories in Vision are able to read tea leaves or possess the Halug, or second sight, which is linked to generations of family members. However, far from espousing the value of this familial trait, the narrator appears to muse over the burden that both knowing and imagining can have on the lives of the Cape Breton characters. The narrator's father's maternal grandmother reads the tea leaves and is concerned by what she sees. There's a quote there, suggesting that the ability to predict future events can cause distress for some. The central protagonist, Mark Unavides, possessed the Halug, which became a weight upon him. In order to stop the visions, he had to abandon his relationship with the woman from Cana. Far from ending the scandal that this relationship was causing, his sacrifice led to a life of loneliness and agony for the woman, who later lacerated her eyes, giving birth to twin girls alone in a barn. Vision suggests that some family traditions leave a trail of destruction and confusion behind them and leave little in the way of value for future generations. So you can see here that this is a part of a paragraph that's clearly arguing against that statement in the essay topic. So you've got to be a bit inventive with the way that you use your knowledge of stories and how you fit them to essay topics. You might go into a story and say, well, or go into an essay and say, well, I know that I've studied vision and I know it's about sight and, the combining of stories. But what if you don't get an essay question that asks you about sight or the way that stories work? And that doesn't mean that therefore that story then becomes irrelevant to you, that all your hard work and your preparation on knowing a story really well is irrelevant. It doesn't. What it means is that you've got to get a bit inventive and say, okay, I know this story so well that I can bend it and I can shape it and I can take other parts of it and put it to an essay topic, and I can still formulate an answer that is dealing with the essay topic, but also bringing in knowledge based on what I know about the stories in Ireland. So you've got to be inventive, but you've got to be clear, okay? And that's, I guess, hopefully what you're seeing here in front of you. I hope that kind of sorted it out. If you're not sure or if vision still is a little bit confusing for you, ask your teacher, come and see me, and we can talk about it a little bit more. But I think there is plenty in this story, and I think lots of people will shy away from it because it's tough. But I think if you can read it a couple of times over to yourself, use these notes on it, you'll get meaning out of it, and there is lots in there that you can talk about and bring to an essay, and that's one way I think that your essay may stand out from the pack. Hope it was helpful. Thanks.